I guess the fact that there are so many of us here reflects our general ignorance about North Korea, and hence curiosity to find somebody who can tell us something meaningful about it. And I would like to start by explaining the format of the evening, which is going to be a 30-minute interview by me or so, with Paul about his book, about North Korea. We will then open the floor to question and answers for another hour or so, or however long is needed. And as this is a reporters' club, I wanted to start by asking Paul to answer some basic reporters' questions about North Korea. A lot of us have tried to find out about the place, to write about it in more than a superficial way, and found it extremely difficult. Firstly, access. I mean, you go to North Korea. How do you manage that?
Well, basically, I lie. It's obviously from a proper reporter's point of view, a correspondent's point of view, it's pretty much impossible, except for those very few times when people are allowed in, and then what they're allowed to see and what they're allowed to do is very, very, very restricted. Probably unlike anywhere else that I can think of. Certainly far more restricted than China. And as I was saying to you earlier, last year I went to Turkmenistan, which is sort of pretty high up on the mad places of the world list, but not anywhere near as restrictive as North Korea. I first started going to North Korea not for any journalism purposes at all. In fact, I'm not a journalist. I started going there because I was doing business in China, and the North Koreans wanted to buy some luxury goods, actually, which the bottom's fallen out of that market now because we've now got sanctions on luxury goods in China. It never was much of a market. And so we were invited there to do some importing or exporting, whichever way you look at it, of luxury goods there. So I went there as a businessman. I've then been back. I went back a number of times on various trade delegations, both real and imagined. Sometimes if you can get 5 businessmen together, you can invent a trade delegation down to North Korea. And if you can get 5 friendly businessmen, or at least ones who think they have maybe some business to do, you can go down there. And now I mostly go back with, of course, there is this idea that North Korea may be about to change, that things may all be about to change. And if they're not all about to change, it doesn't matter because they've changed everywhere else. So now the only place to look at is North Korea. So most of the trips I make to North Korea now are taking bankers, actually, investment bankers down to North Korea who believe that at some point there may be a fortune to be made in North Korea. If not in investing in projects there, then lending money to the North Koreans to get things together. So
at this point, I should make a personal confession, which is that I have a murky past as an investment banker, and in that capacity went to North Korea in 1980 to get our money back. This was after an earlier phase of interest in North Korea, and failed. But the other striking thing to me about the brief time I spent in North Korea was I came away feeling I actually knew less about the country than before I went. It was such a weird place that it was not possible to have any meaningful conversation with anybody. Everybody lied to you. That it was just totally weird and actually very, very hard to keep any perspective. I mean, does going to North Korea actually help?
No, probably not. I've taken kind of now 5 or 6 delegations from major investment banks down there. And, I mean, HSBC, CLSA, emerging markets, major banks. And so far, no one from the Ministry of Economics has ever agreed to meet with us. And these are the kind of people who get high-level access in Beijing and high-level access wherever else they go. And we can't get anyone from the Economics Ministry to meet us. This is because, of course, they may be asked a question about inflation or exchange rates or something like that, and they won't be able to answer the question. So rather than do that, they just don't meet people. So again, there is a problem with what do you actually see when you go there. Now, of course, I think it is useful. One of the things about North Korea is that when you talk to groups about North Korea, the one thing is that most people don't have an image of North Korea in their head. There's hardly anywhere else in the world where we don't have some sort of image of the place in our head. I mean, now we all know kind of what high street Baghdad looks like, and high street Iran, and even high street Kabul and other places. Yet many people don't have any particular image of North Korea in their head, and I find that's quite a hard one to get past. Quite often just run a sort of 100 photographs of Pyongyang sometimes when I'm talking, just because people don't get an idea. You know, is it a sort of messy, crowded but energetic place like a big Chinese city, or you know, is it more regimented like perhaps a Japanese city or something? You know, what is it like? Because we see so few images of it.
In 1980, it was like a morgue. I mean, quite a position. What's it like now?
Pretty much hasn't changed. I mean, the famous one is the Rugong Hotel, the big pyramid-shaped hotel, which is still yet to be topped out, and that hasn't actually been finished and opened yet. No, not much has changed, quite honestly. There's a few more cars on the road than there used to be.
Are there shops?
There are one or two shops. There's Chinese investors have taken over one of the big department stores. There are some more shops. There's more of the low-level stuff. You know, there are farmers markets, which, depending on what time of year you go and how bad things are, you'll be allowed to visit or you won't be allowed to visit. There are kind of little kiosk-y type places selling drinks and biscuits and things. But you know, compared to just about anywhere else in the world, very, very little change has gone on in the last 10 years.
And have you ever had what you might term a real conversation with a North Korean in North Korea? Just somebody appearing to talk frankly, not being conscious that they were talking to a foreigner and that this might put them at risk?
No. I mean, you know, you build up relationships over a longer period of time, and you hope that those relationships pay off. The best relationships I have are actually with several North Koreans who've actually been posted out of North Korea and up to Beijing to work at their embassy or on various projects to try and generate tourism and so on. And I became very useful to them because they had to put their children in international school, and you'd get these phone calls at 1 o'clock in the morning saying, my daughter's just been cast in the school play, and you'd be like, great, that's really good news. Yeah, she's playing Snow White. Who is this woman, and what does she have to wear? You know, that kind of thing. And you'd have to sort of explain what that involved, being Snow White. And then once they're out of North Korea, perhaps they open up a little bit more. North Koreans are very much like, well, they're like South Koreans, obviously, and they're very much like most people, which is they enjoy a pint, they enjoy a dirty joke, they like gossip, and all the things that everyone else likes. But within the confines of North Korea, all of that is very, very difficult. Once they get out, for a visit anyway, they're still very nervous, but slowly things do improve. In North Korea itself, I mean, like anywhere really, if you have the ability to trade something, whether that be information or knowledge or something like that, then people will comment to you. But I often read stories. This is absolutely the wrong place to suggest that journalists don't always totally tell the truth. But I do often read stories on North Korea, and I'm sure it's one of these things that goes round the internet and then comes full circle, you know, where people believe it. Where people say, oh, I went to North Korea on a tour, and the tour guide told me, you know, really we all hate Kim Jong-il and all the rest of it. I just don't believe that. It's never happened to me. I don't know anyone that's ever happened to. And that's just impossible that kind of thing would happen, because the level of clampdown is so very severe. So as I say, occasionally you will get people admit that there are economic problems, that there are problems on this level, and maybe look for some solutions or some ways around, particularly now, around how to get around sanctions, how to get around the embargoes, things like that. That's quite common now. But the idea that someone would comment to you, well, we all hate the government and the best thing would be if they hung Kim Jong-il, I just don't believe it.
That's something I was going to ask you about a lot later, but since we're there, let's jump right in. It is the key question, isn't it? As you put it in your book, is it 1984 Brave New World? You know, are people loathing the government but cowed into submission, or are they in some sort of illusory world where they really do believe all this stuff, that they're living in a socialist paradise, and that there may be some difficulties, but they're because of the nasty imperialists, and it will all be all right?
I think it's the question everyone asks and no one really has an answer to it is, do people believe everything that they're told? Well, on one level, they don't. If you go to, we organise a tour to North Korea's golf club. They have one golf course there in Pyongyang, and officially, and this is up on a board there and in the brochure and everything, the course record was set by the man who played the first round, and it was Kim Jong-il, and he got hole-in-one on the first 17 and took 2 shots on the 18th, and that's the official course record. And when you play the course and you ask them, what's the course record? That's what they tell you. No sly little grin, no kind of wink and a nod or anything. That's the course record. He's the world's greatest golfer. Of course he is, So there, and you wonder, can people really believe that? Or that when Kim Jong-il was born, a glacier cracked and a stork flew forth to inform the Korean people that the dear leader had been born. Do people believe that? Well, no, they don't, but they understand it within the symbolism of traditional Korean thought and things like that. Do they believe what they're told about the country? I would argue that it's probably a little bit more 1984 than Brave New World. I think that the idea of doublethink, that you're constantly told production is up and yet your ration goes down, I think people are intelligent enough to realize that goes on. And people do occasionally, we believe some sort of, where there is dissent, it's often, like in many countries, done through humor and making comments to things like that. But one of the things about disliking your government and disliking your country is that you have to have points of reference. You have to know that life is different somewhere else. After 50 years in North Korea, a vast number of people do not know what life is like outside North Korea.
They do have one point of reference, or a lot of them do, I guess, which is the father and son point of reference. They've only had 2 leaders. And you can understand, or it's easier to understand that there might be some reverence for Kim Il-sung as the revolutionary leader and all that. It's harder to understand that Kim Jong-il is worshipped after a pampered life where he's done very little.
Yeah. More interestingly, though, I think it ties into the history of the founding of North Korea, which is really that, Kim Il-sung, the great leader, was very much seen as a nation builder, as someone who founded the nation, who saved the North Korean people and stood up against American imperialism and so on. And was a man of the army and a man of action. And this, and fought the Japanese, of course, before in the Second World War. And this comes through very strongly in defector interviews. Now, other people have done many more interviews with defectors than I have. And what comes through very clearly, though, is that while defectors, once they're out of the country, are willing to very quickly dismiss Kim Jong-il, they do still cling to the idea that Kim Il-sung was a founder of the nation and a great man and so on. So there clearly is a disjuncture between the two. People are also aware, although they may not know every detail of Kim Jong-il's life and all those stories that we talked about world's biggest cognac buyer and all the stuff that CNN love when they interview you about video collections and he watches horror films and all of this sort of thing. The thing that people do know is that he is not of the armed forces. And in a country of 22 million people, where 1 million people are in a standing army, and it's a country based on its army, effectively, and that the army is so involved in the building of the nation, to not be of the army, to have not seen action, to have not been a guerrilla fighter and so on, does reflect badly on him in many people's eyes. Yet again, the level of repression and so on is so high that no one is going to, if there were pubs, no one is going to go down the pub and say, yeah, but if that guy is not really a soldier like his dad was. That's just not a discussion that's going to happen.
You mentioned defectors, and that's one of the things I hadn't appreciated until reading your book was quite how senior some of these defectors had been, and hence quite what insight foreign intelligence agencies must have into the inner workings of the North Korean regime. Is that true?
Well, I think the South Koreans have a lot of insight into the way the North Korean regime works. I think we don't necessarily need to apply that to the Americans. They seem to be misjudging North Korea, both economically and politically, fairly regularly. The South Koreans, of course, get the defectors, and so I'm not exactly sure what they share with the Americans on that one, or how much the Americans are interested or able to process that information. Clearly, in order to defect from North Korea, I mean, the same question is basically why do thousands and thousands of people not defect from North Korea? And the reason why those that do defect seem to be of such a high level from the very, very elite is that, they are the ones who are able to plan their way out and make the contacts to get themselves out. Technically, anyone could leave North Korea. It's not very difficult to do. All you need to be able to do is walk and time it reasonably right. There's very little stopping people leaving North Korea. Most of the army are bribable. You only have to get across the Yalu River. That's pretty easy to do. It's a very porous border. Of course, the Chinese might send you back. But if you can get past them, a few bribes can get you past them and you can move on or jump an embassy wall in Beijing or Shenyang or somewhere or whatever. Why don't they leave? Well, it's because the government practices retribution on the families. Hwang Jong-yop, who's probably the most senior defector ever, who was one of the architects of Juche theory, very close to Kim Il-sung, was professor of political theory to Kim Jong-il at the Kim Il-sung University. Not many people get to go to their dad's university, and then get their dad's job to run their dad's country. That's pretty good. He went, but then, and rumor has it, no one knows that his daughter was taken out and shot in a labor camp, and they sent him photos of it. I mean, I don't know if that actually happened. That was what the rumor always was. But the fact is that, retribution is practiced against family and close friends. Now, it's one thing to leave a country like people used to leave the ex-Soviet Union or people leave China, and to be able to get to somewhere like the UK and then phone up your family back in Russia, Soviet Union, or now in China or somewhere. But to know that you break all ties completely, you will never be able to write a letter. You will never be able to make a phone call. It's certainly not going to be able to send an email. You're never going to be able to do any of these things. You're never going to see those people again, and you know that they are going to be punished. If not killed, then they will go in a labor camp for a very, very long time. Your family, extended family, and close work colleagues as well. And the higher up the chain you are, the harder that retribution is practiced. So basically, what we seem to be is the ones that get out are the ones at the top who think they're going to be purged anyway. So you might as well make a run for it. And that seems to be what happens, because purging is still something that happens on we don't know the full extent of it, but certainly it's still occurring every so often, political purging. So then you run out. But that's why we see high-level defectors. But for ordinary people, I mean, it's a hell of a lot for a man to say, I hate this country and I want to leave, but then to know that he can get out, but to leave his wife and his children and his parents or whoever. I mean, it's so most people just put their heads down and get on with it,
What do we know about the size and condition of the North Korean gulag?
Well, it stretches across, the numbers as best we know them are in the book, and I haven't got a head for numbers, so I can't remember them. But the point about the gulag, if you like, is that it does stretch from people who've committed really very, very minor crimes, stealing a loaf of bread or something like that during the famine, which admittedly in the old days here would get you sent to Australia, but in North Korea still can get you sent to a labor camp, right through to people who've committed the highest form of crime in North Korea, which would be political crimes, right? Because politics is always number one in North Korea. And some of those camps are just work camps, and some of them people are clearly mistreated. One of the reasons we don't know that much about them, which is one of the sort of mysterious things about North Korea when you try to assess what the level of what the level of disenchantment with the leadership or disbelief or just resistance is that, of course, we don't have large numbers of defectors. We don't have large numbers of refugees. It's not like it was in the Soviet Union or China or the Eastern Bloc or anywhere else. We just don't have large numbers coming out. And when they do come out, they're not writing much. I think in the last couple of years, we must have had 1 or 2 memoirs by North Koreans who've left. There's one particular one, the Aquariums of Pyongyang book. There's another one, I forget the name of, which I got sent recently, which is a memoir of someone during the famine. But that's about all we have, a testimony of people. And, of course, that in itself is very hard to verify. So in that level, what goes on in the camps is very hard to tell. We know that some of them are just people basically working, doing anything from coal mining. Some of them are just big coal mines and things like that. Some of them are clearly more like a prison camp than a gulag, which obviously combines work with labour, or the Laogai type system in China.
Can we talk about the famine for a bit? I mean, because I think in your book, I think you say you have a number showing that 30 years ago or so, North Korea was not much poorer than South Korea. How did it happen? I mean, how did it become a basket case?
Yeah, it's amazing. If you go back to the early 1980s, certainly the mid-1970s, the North Korean and South Korean economies were virtually parallel. If you look at other metrics of development, the two countries were parallel. In fact, North Korea was producing more steel and more machine tools than South Korea. The calorific intake of an average North Korean and South Korean was about the same. Longevity was about the same. And yet here we are now with the statistic that the average South Korean is 5 or 6 inches taller than the average North Korean. The North Koreans have now got the lowest height requirement for their army. And it's something ridiculous. It's like the 5'2" or something like that to get in the army. I mean, this is how much things have changed, and longevity is completely different, and so on, and all the rest of it. So how did this happen? Well, I mean, number one, we have to remember that, of course, South Korea wasn't always South Korea, right? And I know, Simon, we're getting on a bit, but the younger people don't always realise that South Korea used to be one hell of a basket case. It was, and there really wasn't a lot going on in South Korea of interest. And arguably the North looked more likely to prosper with all its heavy industry. That didn't work. But on the other hand, how do you get from, in the mid-1970s being one of the world's top 20 industrialized nations to, by the mid-1990s, starving, arguably, 2 million of your people? How do you manage to do that? And you don't do that by accident, I argue. You do that by mismanaging your economy to a frightening level. How did they do it? Well, put very, very simply, and it takes about 100 pages in the book, but to put very, very simply, you run your entire economy around producing for heavy industry. Most importantly of all, you run a self-sufficiency program so that basically you have to buy in everything. You buy in the entire factory. So your South Koreans are manufacturing under license and making all the money off of manufacturing for Japanese companies like Panasonic and people like that. The Chinese are going into joint ventures and getting all the benefits of a Chinese joint venture, basically stealing all the technology and then making it themselves. And the North Koreans are buying an entire factory, then trying to make the product and do everything with it, but then not paying the people they bought the factory from. So then they run out of spare parts, so the factory grinds to a halt. They then haven't got enough raw materials. They can't get money from anywhere. So that whole system doesn't work. But unlike the South, they considered the South Koreans to be, in hock to the dreaded Japanese, the Chinese in hock to the dreaded Westerner. The North Koreans would be able to go it alone. At the same time, of course, they had a disastrous agricultural policy of collective farming and trying to run everything based on the Lysenko method, which had been discredited in the Soviet Union since the 1960s. And they're still doing it now in North Korea. Very heavy levels of fertilizers, pesticides, insecticides. So, ruining your land over a period of time, but also very expensive way of farming. So the whole thing just collapsed and collapsed.
And as I understand it, your analysis is that they're going to be dependent on outside aid for indefinitely.
Yeah, I mean, they've made very few changes to their agricultural policy anyway, and they are still a long, long way away from food security, the basic ability to be able to feed people without the country falling into starvation. They simply cannot do it.
So how hungry are people now?
Well, how hungry people are is hard to gauge. You can look at the sort of distribution that the World Food Programme is offering and how many people in the country they're feeding. Last time I looked, it's something like 40% of people rely on World Food Programme. Every year, the World Food Programme never has enough food, never has enough aid for North Korea, and has to do an emergency appeal. Not an easy one, not the most charitable of cases, really, North Korea. The idea that, you're never going to have a live aid for Pyongyang or something like that. Oh, yeah, it's just not very sexy that way. But the problem, I think, which is really crucial to understand, is that the famine in the mid-1990s was really a rural phenomenon. It was outside of the major cities and certainly outside of Pyongyang. What has gone on in the last couple of years, the economic reforms of 2002, which failed very quickly and very disastrously, has meant that the amount of food in Pyongyang, particularly, but in 2 or 3 other cities around the country, is now in shortage. So if we were to have what people call the double apocalypse, which would be a withdrawal of food aid combined with another year or two of disastrous famines, either due to disastrous harvests due to flood or drought, both of which are very common in North Korea. So the amount they were able to grow declined, and the amount being taken into the country as humanitarian aid declined. That this time it would not be the case that it would be people out in the countryside dying, and of course with no journalists there, that's how come it was able to be hushed up, the so-called slow motion famine of North Korea. But also this time around it would be in the cities as well, that the famine would strike into Pyongyang and Sinuiju and Kaesong and into other cities as well, which is an even worse scenario than last time around.
If that were to happen, or even if it didn't get that bad, where are we now on South Korean attitudes to reunification? Because that seems to be the end game, that this is a failed state, and that just as West Germany absorbed East Germany, the South should take over the North, and it's got money. The East German experience sort of created a sea change in South Korean attitudes, but does that persist, or is there an appetite in the South for reunification now?
Well, reunification is one of those things, a bit like believing in God in America. It's like, when someone comes up with a clipboard and says, "Do you believe in God?" every American seems to say yes, right? It's just automatic. And
except that a lot of South Koreans do have relatives in North Korea.
Yeah, they do. But but if you push people on unification, they always kind of like, it never quite, get that. So that's why all the different surveys you see are always so conflicted. Sometimes you'll see surveys that say, well, most young people would like unification, or they like Kim Jong-il even, or something like that. Well, who knows why they say that. But then, when they're pushed on it, they're not so keen on it because, most South Korean 20, 30-somethings are struggling to pay their mortgages and pay off their credit card debts in South Korea. Right? So you never get this feeling that anyone really wants unification. That's my argument. Nobody wants reunification. Obviously, the leadership in the North doesn't want it because it means they're redundant. The Southerners don't want it because the economic cost is going to be a real burden to pay. The Chinese don't want it because that just makes life more difficult for them on their geopolitical strategy. And I think
does it still? I mean,
yeah.
I know you said, but you can see an argument now that China, like Japan, once sort of feared the idea of a strong united Korea, but it wouldn't be. It would be a weak united Korea.
Yeah, but I think what would annoy the Chinese now, given that they're strictly business people, would be that the amount of money that the reunification would cost might hit the China-South Korea trade balance, right? I mean, if everyone's having to pay higher taxes and spend all their money trying to patch together this wasteland to the north, they won't be buying so much from China. And what's the trade balance at now? It's like over 20 billion two-way trade, right? So it's a very important relationship for China. So I'm not sure that anyone's really that keen on it. And I don't think that the Germany example is the one that's always used, but I'm not sure how relevant that is. Firstly, I think that, the numbers for Germany are not really relevant to Korea now anyway. But secondly, I think that, in East Germany, my understanding was in East Germany, I mean, it was about as good as the Eastern Bloc got in terms of the state of its factories and its engineering. It wasn't producing the best steel and the best cars and all the rest of it, but at least it was producing them. And the workers were skilled, and they'd been doing things for the last 20 years rather than just pushing brooms around and then being sent out to forcibly collect the harvest and so on, which is what's been happening increasingly in North Korea. Also, you can't underestimate the decline in North Korea through the asset stripping that has gone on in the last 5 years. There are factories across North Korea that are just not factories. They've sold everything, every bit of scrap metal, every bit of copper wire, every bit of virgin timber they can get their hands on has been trucked over to the Chinese. And that's how much of the economy runs now. I mean, brilliant story last year was, the Chinese, of course, are the biggest donors of food. The Chinese were sending trains down to North Korea full of grain, and after a couple of months, the Chinese suddenly realized something was wrong because none of the trains were coming back. Drivers were being sent back. None of the trains were coming back. So they had to get on the phone, or whatever you do to Pyongyang, and explain to them that, no, we're giving you the grain. Right? But you're supposed to send the train back. And the North Koreans, because they're wonderful like this. I mean, they treat the Chinese with as much disdain as anyone else. Just more, probably. Just turned around and said, oh, right, okay. So then some trains came back. Of course, what had been going on was the grain had gone down there. It had been offloaded. Then someone else had taken the train off the rails, broken it down into scrap metal, driven it on trucks up to Dandong on the border, and sold it back to the Chinese as scrap metal. Because the Chinese will buy any scrap metal, right? They're so commodity hungry. So basically they were trucking up their own things. But if you go to Dandong, you see the real thing. The trucks coming across are full of timber, which is very important because not only are the North Koreans not reseeding when they're cutting down timber, but this is why we have so much flooding in North Korea, because they're cutting down all the trees, which of course provide the natural flood breaks and stop mudslides and things like that. So all of that's being sold. You'll see all the scrap metal going over, which is the factories, the copper wire. There are North Korean people that go backwards and forwards across the border illegally, and they're bringing, just wire wrapped around their thing. And China will buy any of that comes across the border.
So it's an aid-dependent basket case. It's a criminal regime. It has a human rights record as bad as anywhere in the world, and it's got the bomb. First question, how did it manage to do that? I mean, it bought missiles from China, sold the technology to Pakistan, and bought nuclear technology in exchange? Or how did they develop the expertise to get a nuclear weapon?
Well, I should say, personally, I don't know they've got a bomb. I mean, I know they blew something up, but I don't know what they blew up. My understanding of it is that, they were involved in programs with the Russians, the Soviets from a very early stage. They were in programs with the Chinese from a very early stage as well. So they've managed to develop this technology, if they have developed this technology, so they have a bomb, So there we are, they have a bomb. They obviously saw it as something that they would always have. I'm not someone who gets overly worked up about the North Koreans having a bomb. It doesn't seem to me to be anything to particularly worry about.
I mean, I've heard that before because people say, well, they're 20 miles from Seoul anyway with a lot of heavy artillery. Yeah. If they wanted to do a lot of damage, the bomb does make a big difference. But it does seem to matter to the to the Americans in particular,
sure,
and the Japanese.
That's why you get one. I mean, look, anyone can say I'm simple-minded, but to me, the bomb is a very simple thing. It's we went through a round of economic reform in 2002. It didn't really work. The North Koreans still, I think, would like to do economic reform. There's certainly groups within the country, including Kim Jong-il, who would like to do economic reform. But two things happened last year. One was the Americans and then the Chinese froze the bank accounts, their overseas bank accounts in Macau and then in Austria and elsewhere, and in China. The thing was that some nefarious activities may have happened in those bank accounts. But basically, those bank accounts were used to buy imports, to underwrite trade, right, to do all the things that any country needs to do. They now can't do that. And the other one, which was really important, which would have been a big green light and a big useful symbol to the Reform Caucus in Pyongyang, was what's been going on in Kaesong, where you have the development zone with South Koreans producing things. Now, a lot of people say Kaesong's not that important. All they're doing is producing cigarette lighters and T-shirts and cups and saucers and things. Well, I think that is pretty important because that's how Shenzhen got going and Wenzhou and Guangdong province, and they've done okay out of that. But when the Americans and the South Koreans sat down to do the free trade agreement, the South Koreans wanted Kaesong-made products to be part of that free trade agreement, and the Americans ruled that out of court. They said, there's no way we're going to talk about that. And that, plus the shutting down of bank accounts, slammed the door pretty firmly shut in the face of any reform element in Pyongyang.
So you think it was a mistake that the bank account shouldn't have been shut down?
But, you can shut the bank account down as a warning and then open them up again. I think this ties into something much bigger, though. And you can look at Kaesong goods through something else. So anyway, then, once the door's been slammed on reform, what do? Well, you go away and you finish your bomb off, right? Because you haven't got much else to do. So you finish your bomb off, and then you say, right, now here's what we've got. It's for sale. What are you going to give us for it, right? Now, we know what the price is because we've been here before in 1994. We know that it's, 2 light water reactors and 500,000 tons of oil and some food aid, right? We know that the bomb is negotiable, right?
But it's, is it really? Because, the thing I found frightening about it is that once you've put them definitively out of use, assuming they have a program and they end it, then it's a card they've played once and can't use again. And it's a very hard one to give up. And if you listen to what the North Koreans have been saying in Beijing around the six-party talks, do you really think we built a bomb just to give it up? It's going to be very... the price is going to go up and up, isn't it?
But I don't understand why there's this idea that we can't negotiate or buy away this bomb. Did it in South Africa, did it in Libya, right?
Sure, but I'm just questioning whether the North Koreans would sell.
Yeah, sure. If you pay the right amount of money or give the right amount of aid, I'm sure they're willing to do it. What I don't understand is to go back to your point about why are these things why shut down bank accounts or whatever, is why is there no roadmap going on here, right? Why are we at the six-party talks with America saying you must do this before we will do this, which prompts a belligerent response from the North Koreans, and the North Koreans are best in the world at belligerent responses. But the Americans are very good at it as well. Why is it everywhere else in the world we have these damn roadmaps and we have these phased-in things and these staged approaches, yet we don't with North Korea in the six-party talks?
But on the other hand, the Americans, having insisted that it all has to be through the six-party talks and they won't talk bilaterally to North Korea, are this week engaged in bilateral talks with them on justice in Berlin.
Yeah. So hopefully the Americans are now starting to move that way. The theory that most people have now is that, what we've all always believed is that, change will come in North Korea when there is regime change. And what we always thought that meant was regime change in Pyongyang. What we now realize is that probably change will come when there's regime change in Washington, which is 2009. Right?
So they're basically going to talk out this administration and try and deal with the Democrat successor.
They talk these guys out. And if you look at what people that were on the Clinton team and the early Bush team, the sort of hangovers, Jack Pritchard and people like that, are saying is, this can be negotiated away, deals can be done. It's like, the North Koreans say, we'll come back to the talks if you lift the freeze on our bank accounts, which seems to me eminently sensible. They need to be able to do that. And the Chinese say, well, maybe we can do that. And the Americans say no. But why can there not be, why is there not a roadmap on this? Why is there not checks and balances on that? Well, we'll lift the restrictions on your bank accounts, but then we'll monitor them. Right? I mean, this is the sort of process we see everywhere else in the world where these things happen. This is what we talk about in the Middle East and what we talk about in other parts of the world. We talk about roadmaps and confidence-building measures and all the rest of it. Yet around the six-party talks, we just have this very blunt, you do this or I'm not doing anything. And if there's a country in the world not to treat like that, it's North Korea, because they're just going to respond in kind.
There's a lot more questions I had, but I think it's only fair to open up the floor to questions from all of you now. So thank you very much, Paul. And one straight away. In fact, could I ask you to identify yourselves?
Tom Fenton, an American journalist. You've suggested one of the basic ways that the United States misjudges North Korea politically and economically. Can you be more specific about some of the other ways?
Well, I think it's fair to say, and it's not an original thought. I mean, it's the best example of it if you read Don Oberdorfer's book from the Washington Post, The Two Koreas. I mean, he lays it out brilliantly. It's one of the best book on Korea ever written, I think. There is a problem with American policy on Korea, North and South, full stop. And that is that Korea has always been an afterthought of American policy. America always reacts when it comes to Korea. It never, what's the opposite of reacting on something? It's never proactive on Korea. It's always reactive. And that's been the history of America in Korea. And that is a problem. And that is how American policy often feels on North Korea at the moment. Sorry, what was your question?
Well, that was it. Just if there are other ways.
Yeah.
It's just if there are other ways in which America misjudges the regime. In addition to the basic problem, they don't know how to negotiate with it.
Well, there's that. And the other major problem is they keep thinking it's going to collapse. Right? I mean, we just had last year this new release of papers from Washington that said that they thought it would have collapsed in 2006 or whatever it was. Right? Clinton, after the 1994 agreed framework, Clinton started to be sluggish on delivery of, there's all kinds of arguments as to why the agreed framework fell apart. And neither side can be painted whiter than white on that. Obviously, the North Koreans were lying and still tinkering around with bombs, but the Americans were very sluggish on sending through what they'd promised to send through. And part of the reason for that was that the CIA had given Clinton an assessment that said that the economy was going to implode. And then we find out last year with the release of papers that again, a couple of years later, they were told that, the end game in Korea will be implosion. And that seems to me and I don't know what Bush is being told now. There's all kinds of rumors going around as to what Bush is being advised now. But, relying on North Korea to implode seems to me a rather ridiculous game. I mean, it is one of those countries. We thought, when the Soviet Union collapsed, North Korea was going to implode, right? When Kim Il-sung died, North Korea was going to implode. When they had a famine and killed 2 million of their own people, North Korea was going to implode. Kim Jong-il would never be able to secure power. The country would implode. I mean, it goes on and on with this idea that it's going to collapse. What people forget, which is the argument of my book, is stop waiting for North Korea to collapse. It has collapsed. Right? It collapsed quite a long time ago. But countries continue to go on when they've collapsed. I mean, they have a drip feed of aid, and they continue to sort of limp along, and regimes continue to stay in power. But waiting for some sort of implosion, which is what the CIA periodically seems to advise American presidents, doesn't help, because then, of course, your negotiating stance becomes all confused with that prediction of collapse. At the moment, it's hard to say what they're really doing that's wrong. Of course, what we thought was that the six-party talks, the renewed six-party talks coming after the midterm elections in America, that perhaps there might be a change of direction. There wasn't really. probably because they were a bit soon after. I don't know how long these things take to filter through government. I mean, I'm British, so I assume everything takes years and years to filter through government at any level. But, you know, these things, it was a bit too quick for it to have filtered through. There's talk going on now, both at the UN and in Germany and things, you know, who knows what's being talked about now, and the side channels that are going on, that maybe things are changing. But I think, you know, as Simon said quite correctly, I think that the North Korean game now is to talk it out to, you know, the election in 2008 and then 2009 with regime change.
Gwyneth Henderson, I'm just very curious as to what you think may happen. Okay, not implosion, and, you know, maybe we get a new sense after what it'll be 2000 and whatever it'll be when we get a new Washington administration. But you said right at the beginning there are no points of reference. I have no sense of what sort of education system applies, how people get, and I'm not talking about Snow White, but how people get any information or what sort of sense they make, and that if and when change comes, how on earth does anybody deal with 22 million people who have no other reference points?
Yeah, it's scary. Someone at the Unification Ministry in Seoul once told me that the big difference between East and West Germany and North and South Korea was the first thing they'd have to do was send in a crack squad of specialist psychologists to just go and do psychiatric work in North Korea. Because people, if you look at the North Koreans that get out of North Korea and get to South Korea, it's actually a very sad story. They get given quite a lot of support and help by the government in Seoul, but they invariably, I'm afraid, end up going bankrupt, marriages falling apart, alcoholics, things like that. It's very hard to adapt. The psychological strains on North Koreans coming out of their country is very hard. And I mean, obviously that we've seen that as a pressure in East Germany with the rise of neo-Nazism and people hankering after a sort of a supposed past that they had and things like that. And I think North Korea would be very confusing that way. And it's very hard to estimate how it is. In my book, I posit a few scenarios because I think you can't just sort of go around saying this is right and that's right and the Americans are wrong and everything without giving your own version of what might happen. You have to sort of offer a solution. But one of the things that's interesting is so much of what we've seen in other communist countries doesn't apply in North Korea. One of the major reasons that there's not been change in North Korea is that even unlike the Chinese, there is no space, no ideological space to admit that the leadership is wrong. So even in China, we have the famous saying of Mao being, 70% good, 30% bad. That seems to have been around for a long time. I'm always asking Chinese friends if they think it's time to readjust that percentage now. Can we go to 60-40 yet?
There was that drop stroke on the 18th hole.
So that's the only time he's ever got away with anything. But you can't say that. So that's one of the problems with reform. In China, you could say that. Deng Xiaoping could say that. 70% good, 30% bad, which means we can adjust pricing or something like that. We can say that mistakes were made in the past. North Korea, you can't. It's very rigid like that. That's part of the theory. And also, if you look at everything else, successful dissident for people to rally around, a sort of Václav Havel type character or something like that. There's none of that. Religion, right? What you may have seen as the, Islam in Central Asian Soviet republics or the Catholic Church in Poland. No equivalent of that now in North Korea, really. Religion really been driven completely underground and driven out. Independent trade unions, a sort of solidarity or something like that. That doesn't exist either. All combined with a far less awareness of the outside world than anywhere else. I mean, no indication that the level of knowledge that at least East Europeans had of the world outside Eastern Europe, or that Soviet Russians had of the world outside the Soviet Union, was fairly high. And certainly in China, there's always been that awareness of the outside world, even at the worst of times in the Cultural Revolution, because of the overseas Chinese community in Hong Kong and things. I think people had a higher awareness. But North Korea is one of those places where people don't have that awareness outside. They're not even that aware of soul. And I remember being in North Korea, in Pyongyang, during the World Cup, when it was in Japan and Korea. And they did show the South Korean games in North Korean TV. But sitting there with some North Korean friends who all commented, they were all fascinated by the advertising and all the rest of it. They didn't sort of believe it. And all those stories about the first North Korean delegations going to the South and accusing the famous one is, they got there at night. And they accused the South Koreans of playing tricks because they must have ordered all the buildings to switch their lights on and got everyone in South Korea to drive around aimlessly. It's not possible that you can have this many cars on the road and this many things like that. And that sort of thing. There is still that very low level of awareness among ordinary people, and no way to really filter it down. I mean, it's a sort of a stupid one, but it's the only country in the world I've been to where they don't know who Michael Jackson and the Beatles are quite often, I mean, being a useless Brit, I remember being on a delegation of Brits there, and the first thing the North Koreans always ask you to do at an exchange thing, where they always bring, I think it's a communism thing, they always show you lots of children, You have to look at a country's children. And then the children, of course, sing a song to you. And it's some song about how great the dear leader is and how he cares for children and all the rest of it. Then they turn round to us 15 Brits standing there and they say, now sing us a song of your country. Well, we don't really have many of those. Anyway, we did Yellow Submarine. And we were like, the Beatles. And no idea. So that makes any kind of resistance, and it's hard to see where the growth of a resistance movement would come from. It's not going to come from dissidents outside the country. It's not going to come from the church. It's not going to come from an independent trade union movement. And of course, every year that goes by, we've got less and less people exposed to education. I know that the North Koreans are sending more people out to do MBAs and things like that because they realize they need particularly economics knowledge and finance knowledge if they're to survive. But
where are they going?
Well, they go all over the place. Obviously a lot to China, but they always went to China. A lot going to Malaysia. I don't know why Malaysia particularly, but they seem to be sending some to Malaysia. But no, they're sending them out to do MBAs and finance and just learn things like bookkeeping. And, in China they'll be learning double entry bookkeeping, I guess. But
there was another question at the back there.
Frank Jackson, World Disarmament Campaign. I was going to ask a very simple question to begin with, which Paul has actually already answered, which is how you pronounce Juche. I've seen it in print and never known how to pronounce it. So thanks for that anyway. But more seriously, I have here a magazine called Arms Control Today, which has a lot of articles about North Korea and the bomb and everything. And one particular thing that I picked out, it talks about the possibility of North Korea selling fissile material to Al-Qaeda. Now, that's a fairly horrifying thought in itself, and it's one of the bogeymen that are set up when we talk about nuclear weapon proliferation and so on. You've actually already said a bit about what I think is very sensible about the North Korean nuclear weapons. But what do you think about that specific point?
Yeah, well, I think that's exactly what you say. It's a bogeyman. It's a red herring that's set up all the time. There's a rumor going around at the moment that the Americans and the Chinese have done a deal under the table about this thing called the red line, which is if the North Koreans were to move beyond what the Americans and Chinese determined to be a red line on arms proliferation, that they would move in and do something really tough, which means the Chinese would shut the border down, which is basically the only way sanctions would work, because it wouldn't then be sanctions, it would just be isolating the country completely. And this red line is supposed to be sales of nuclear weapon technology to terrorist organizations. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. I think it's just a rumor that's floating around. On the other hand, I can understand why the Chinese had signed that, because it would get them a lot of house points in Washington, which they're always quite keen to get, despite what they may say. And on the other hand, they know it's a safe bet. There's no evidence. There's never been any evidence that the North Koreans have ever sold nuclear technology to terrorist groups. And I think it's for the same reason as there's never been any evidence that a private businessman from outside can make any money in North Korea. I should know, I tried. Right? It's because they have a mindset of nation-to-nation business. And if you look at the business that's going on in North Korea now, it's joint ventures between state-owned Chinese companies and state-owned North Korean companies. Or, state-owned oil company with the North Korean Ministry of Energy. And when they've done deals on nuclear technology in the past, it's been with the government of Pakistan or whoever else they may or may not have done it with. They do government-to-government business. That's their mindset. It's the way they see of doing things. And there's no evidence that anyone's ever come up with that says that they have sold nuclear weapons to terrorists or they have any particular contact with terrorists. I know, people will try and catch me out on this. I know that the Japanese Red Brigade people lived in North Korea.
And they have been involved in terrorism themselves.
They've been involved in terrorism themselves, but that's not the same as dealing with terrorists. They of course have been known to blow up airliners and
half the South Korean cabinet.
It's
not a scrupulous regime.
Yeah, no, it's not. But there really isn't. But there's no evidence that they're sending people to Al Qaeda with brochures of what they have to offer them and things like that. I just don't think it works that way. And the point is, of course, as Simon says, it's not that they're particularly scrupulous or that they couldn't do that if they wanted to, even though they haven't done that. But this is something that's being thrown up as a major kind of, I think, red herring at the moment. I don't think the North Koreans want to do that. If you follow my theory, which is that the bomb is just one big thing that is what they've got that we have to buy, and basically the price of it is to secure that regime, because all they're interested in is regime survival and just staying there in power. And I'll say, again, as I say in the book, and I think a lot of people don't always appreciate, always remember with the North Korean regime, the leadership, it's not a very big group of people, but they don't have anywhere particularly to go. Pyongyang airport is not full of fueled up private jets ready to take off for the south of France at a moment's notice, right? Or wherever dictators go and live when they get thrown out of their countries. They're not all got French Riviera property, right? These guys are staying where they are, or they're getting hung by their own people. So they've got to stay where they are, and they've got to hang on to power somehow.
And in your analysis, we've got to pay for them to do it.
And we've got to pay for them to do it. It's not a very pleasant scenario, but I would argue that the alternative is much, much worse.
There's no question over there was the first, I think.
Thanks. Paul, my name is Frank Ledridge. I'm a barrister. I was quite struck by some of the things you said about the regime, and there may be one slight analogy, and that's Albania. And clearly there are significant differences, not least in size, 3 million in against, 20 million in North Korea. But all those features of repression existed there, and exclusion and isolation. But that's a comment, and I'd be interested to hear your views on that. And one question, if I might. You touched on the issue of the gulags and the atrocious human rights condition there. I'm wondering if there's any penetration at all, or any opportunities for penetration by human rights, either in the international organization level, the UN, for example, or the NGO level, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty.
I'll take that in reverse, actually. No one really gets into the gulags in North Korea. The relationship that the North Koreans have with the NGOs is very, very odd. For years, they didn't want them to come in. Then they finally let them in. Then they're officially governed by the Flood Relief Rehabilitation Committee, so they won't even admit that it was a famine. Now they have a bit more scope to operate now, but they still don't get to all parts of the country, and monitoring supplies and things like that is still very difficult, which raises all these questions of whether or not the food aid that we give to North Korea really doesn't do any more than just feed the army and things like that. I'm not sure that's that big a question, because when you've got a population of 22 million and 1 million of them are in the army, feeding the army actually probably means that food gets to a hell of a lot of people. Right? But we don't really able to monitor these things. So the idea of getting access to the North Korean gulag, I think, is not likely to happen. Albania, I never had the pleasure of visiting Albania, so I can't really say. I do remember years and years ago as a teenager going to a meeting of the Communist Party of Britain, Marxist-Leninist, where they tried to sell me on the idea that Albania was the most developed country in Europe. And they did this by estimating that the amount of railway track that the Albanians have built in the last 10 years was more than any other country in Europe. But Albania, as you rightly said, about the size of it and the fact that all the other countries had railways already, meant that when they built half a mile of railway track, they were steaming ahead of the rest of Europe. The interesting thing is that part of the reason that North Korea survives the way it does, and part of the reason people are willing to buy into the theory, the Juche theory, is this, what I term a theatrical victimhood, which is the first thing you notice when you're in North Korea, arguably, is that the Second World War ended yesterday, or the occupation of Korea by the Japanese ended yesterday. It's drilled into people all the time, and in newspapers, in television, schools, education, and so on. So there is this constant victimhood around that period. And of course, it was a terrible time, the war and the occupation of the Korean Peninsula by the Japanese. But on the other hand, it's clearly being used for political purposes now by the regime. My understanding now, as I said, is that one of the elements in Albania was Islam, which I think was underground but still operated there. There were other elements in Albania, as I understand it, around internal relations within Albania, and I really don't know Albania, so I'm not sure. But I mean, somehow, the North Koreans have managed to isolate themselves. The Albanians broke out. I guess that's a good thing for them. I'm not exactly sure what happened to them there. The one scenario, I never really thought of Albania much. I mean, the one a lot of people think about is Romania, which of course is, again, I don't think any of these are particularly applicable, which is why I don't use any of them as being applicable to. But the interesting one about Romania, of course, is the level of the secret police there, which is an interesting one, the self-policing of that, and of course the economic system there being self-sufficient, but of a sizable country as opposed to Albania. So I can't really comment that much on Albania. You'd have to ask an Albanian expert.
I think that there's at least 4 questions waiting. There's 2 at the back, I think.
I'm Chris Morris from BBC News. Paul, you mentioned the fact that Kim Jong-il is not of the armed forces. Is it possible to say to what extent that could make elements within the armed forces an alternative centre of power? Do you think there are elements within the armed forces who perhaps have a plan B if Kim Jong-il were to fall under the proverbial Pyongyang omnibus?
Yeah, well, fortunately, due to the fuel shortages and power, the omnibuses are moving so slowly. The other rumour going around at the moment is that a group of analysts in America, this is a really scary one actually, walked into the White House and briefed George Bush that they believe that the Chinese are preparing a coup in Pyongyang to put their own guy in. Not that that's unbelievable. I just don't think it's good to cloud George Bush's mind with these kind of stories at this moment in time. That of course has always been a possibility, and I'm a believer in that, because I did a survey at the end of last year of about 12 leading academics in think tanks in China, and of course think tanks in China are quite all government linked at some point, and so they're useful guys to talk to. Interestingly, they have a totally different view on North Korea to the Americans. They believe Kim Jong-il is someone you can do business with. They believe the bomb is for sale and is negotiable. But they also believe that he is distanced from the army. And some of these think tanks are PLA think tanks. And I think, People's Liberation Army think tanks. And I think that's an interesting one because, we always used to say, or they always used to say, that the Chinese-North Korean relationship was akin to that of lips and teeth. That's how close it was. And then some Chinese academic came out with this pretty funny remark, which everyone remembers because not every day a Chinese academic says something funny, which was the North Koreans should remember that when the lips are gone, the teeth are cold. And that's sort of very Chinese. And they were sort of sending subtle messages that way. And there is this group called the Chrysanthemum Group, was being referred to as the Chrysanthemum Group, which I think is a combination of some of the younger technocratic element in Pyongyang that were involved in the reforms of 2002. Some North Koreans living outside North Korea, but obviously still attached to the regime in various embassy postings, and Chinese academics. And they've all been working together. The Chinese believe that their reform package has a universality to it. I actually don't think that's true, for reasons I argue in the book. But they believe that the Chinese economic reform process has a universal. You can almost slap a blueprint of it onto North Korea. And the way to get rid, what needs to go is Kim, because Kim is a block internationally on things. Kim is not someone that people see as someone you can do business with. He's not someone who's personally liked very much around the world, even by his friends. He's not liked very much. So you've got to get rid of him. And the argument has always been that you bring in a North Korean general. Now, that rumor as well gained currency around 2002, particularly around the issue of Sinway-ju and the economic zone that was going to be there, because in a country where the military is so involved in nation building, the idea of technically giving away sovereignty on part of your territory is bound to annoy the army. And it was believed that Kim annoyed the army. I also believe it's true, and again, a lot of this is rumor, and we're never able to prove anything on North Korea, but the issue that many in the army are annoyed by the prominence that is given to the bomb. That these guys have built up an army that created a nation, that can defend a nation, and that with the dug-in artillery and all the rest of it can still do a hell of a lot of damage, particularly to South Korea, and can take care of itself. That all this fixation on the bomb is there. So you bring in a general, you get rid of Kim, who no one can do business with. You bring in a general who keeps everything the same. You still have Juche, you still have the borders locked down. Everything stays the same, except this guy is willing to negotiate away the bomb and work with Beijing on a sensible economic reform program. And my for what it's worth, I know everyone hates doing it, but I think you have to. I think that is ultimately what will happen. But what will be the actual catalyst for the Chinese to decide to do that, I don't know.
I think there are 4 questions waiting. There's one more at the back. This lady here, I think, was first, and then 2 in the middle.
Thank you for the intriguing talk. My name is Morana Song, and I'm Korean. I'm studying at LSE right now, and I'm from South Korea. You said no one in South Korea actually wants reunification with North Korea. As a South Korean who has lived in Seoul for the last 25 years, I've seen so many NGOs and even religious groups and the government putting so much effort to realize the reunification with North Korea. And I was wondering if you could more elaborate your position on that, like based on what fact you said so.
Well, I disagree with you, because I don't think that the NGOs and the government and the unification ministry is doing any of it to bring around unification. I think they're doing it to stop the North from collapsing and ended up with a very big bill and a destabilized region. And I think, that they will continue to do that. And I think when you talk to people at the unification ministry, of course there's an official line that they talk, as with the Bank of Korea. But what they realize is that, you have to go in and do some strategic stuff. It's in no one's interest for the country to collapse. Of course, specifically not South Korea's and specifically not China's. So certain things need to be done. And if you look at what's gone on in the North, I mean, number one, the reason that everything changed and these NGOs are allowed to even do this is because the South Korean government got so nervous about what a collapse would involve that it lifted the laws on contact between South Koreans and North Koreans, right? I mean, the first Buddhist groups and so on that went there all used to get arrested, right? Because if you didn't do it through the Korean Red Cross, you were breaking the law on contact. And they've had to lift that law. But then if you look at the projects that are sanctioned, the ones that you have to apply for permission to do any project from the south to the north. If you look at them, they're all in very key areas. I mean, of course, there's some food aid, there's some medical aid, and then they're in interesting things that all of us would be interested in, which would be unflooding the coal mines and so on, so that they can get coal back out of them to get power going again. They're around power, or they're around agriculture and fertilizer supplies because of this very heavy need for fertilizer. And I think if you look at the projects that are always agreed upon, they invariably tend to be projects that will keep North Korea bubbling along, if you like, rather than collapsing. Because, the idea that is in some way promoting unification, I think, is not quite correct in reality. So what they're doing is looking for, the Chinese have this great new saying that they've got now, which is North Korea is terrible the way it is, but we absolutely love it where it is, right? And we don't want it moving anywhere. And I think that many people in South Korea understand that they have a lot of issues to deal with, first on their own economy and, of course, their relationship with America, before unification can come any closer. What it would be nice to get back to, I think, is back to to build in the cross-border family contacts and everything of the Sunshine Policy. I think people would support that. But whether or not these policies are really designed to actually achieve a reunification as soon as possible, I think that doesn't seem to me to be what's going on. I think it's something slightly different going on there.
There's a question in the middle there.
Fiona Graham, BBC News. I was just sort of curious when you're talking about the isolation of the people sort of in North Korea, and how little they know about the outside world. And I suppose I'm sort of thinking in terms of, you're sort of reading things about satellite dishes being smuggled across the Chinese border, sort of disguised as different household objects, and there being a certain amount of toing and froing over the border, and also the fact that there is a limited amount of tourism going on at the moment from Western countries into the country. I suppose I just wondered the degree to which this isolation sort of holds true. I mean, how much people really know about what goes on out with sort of Korea, or whether they still sort of believe that the South Koreans are running around in rags.
I certainly don't think that is true. I mean, I wouldn't worry. I've not seen satellite dishes, but that'd be pretty hard to hide. Mobile phones, of course, is a big one, because if you're in the top third of North Korea, your Chinese mobile can work. So basically you buy a very cheap mobile phone unit with a Chinese SIM card, charge it right up, and you can use that in North Korea. So there is some of that going on. The issue, Western tourists, I don't really think is that much of an issue. They're so corralled and there's so few of them and things that's not necessarily going to help much. Anyway, half the people that go to North Korea are more mad than the people in North Korea anyway. So, I mean, that's always been true of North Korea. The interesting thing has been the signs of things coming in from the south, right? And you know this whole wave of interest in South Korean culture now, and the Hallyu culture and so on, and all these massively long and, in my opinion, totally boring, but my wife, who's Chinese, thinks they're all fantastic soap operas, these Cinderella stories that come out of South Korea with the music and the good-looking boys and the girls with plastic surgery and all the rest of it that's coming out of South Korea, and sort of changing the culture in Asia. That these are coming into the north, and that they're becoming aware of South Korean culture particularly, and of course, any Chinese city, you can buy all the South Korean DVDs pirated. So, of course, that South Korean culture is also coming in from China. So more and more young people, particularly at the elite end of the country, are aware of all these South Korean stars and the South Korean musicians, pop stars and things like that, which is very interesting. How that's actually going to filter through and change attitudes, though, I don't know. And how deep into the society that's going. I imagine it's only at a very high level at the moment. I mean, obviously, actually getting a DVD player and things is not the easiest of things always in North Korea. But people at a higher level do have DVD players, right? I mean, it's one of the perks of being... I mean, we're talking about an elite here that to be a member of means plasma screen TV, DVD player, and, you're allowed to have a dog or something, right? So, I mean, it's that sort of level. So, but how much this South Korean culture coming in will affect things, I don't know. I've never been that great a fan of the idea that letting everyone in the Soviet Union listen to Guns N' Roses somehow brought down communism. I've never bought that idea. I always thought it was because they screwed their economy. And I think the same thing will be true of North Korea.
So, question over there, the lady, and then the gentleman at the back.
Erica Herrera-Martinez from Dow Jones. This isn't a particularly highbrow question, but it's more to do with the logistics of how you actually got to North Korea. I mean, where do you stay? Are there hotels? Are there restaurants? What do you go about doing when you're hungry on Pyongyang High Street?
Feel part of a big gang when you're hungry. Yeah, well, I mean, there are hotels. There are restaurants. They're not they're not open to everyone necessarily. The hotels are, of course, very restricted as to who can go in and out of them. Traveling into North Korea is not always as it's portrayed here. Again, I think there's a lot of things that go around the internet, and someone wrote about them 10 years ago, and someone Googled North Korea, and they all read these same things and come around. The last 5 or 6 times I've been in, they haven't confiscated my mobile phone. They did used to confiscate mobile phones, but no one's confiscated my mobile phone. I read something on the internet, they were confiscating iPods. I took my iPod in, no one confiscated it. Digital cameras, video cameras, but people say that all these things are confiscated, but it never seems to happen to me, and the tourist groups that I hear go in, that never happens to them. They can be a little touchy about what you take photographs of, and they worry about things, but nothing much. So as a foreigner there on a delegation or a tour group or something, then the hotel rooms are fine, and basically they're all right. I mean, I take in rich investment bankers, so they moan about the rooms, but they're used to, the Radisson or something normally, so they would moan about anything. But they're fairly decent hotel rooms, and the Yanggak-do, which is the one that we usually put people on, although it is on an island where the gate comes down at night and things like that, which is a little bit off-putting, makes you feel like a bit of a leper of imperialism, works quite well. They obviously, again, it's very difficult to go in if you're American. They have small windows where Americans are allowed in, but then that seems to shut again. I was on a tour there, actually, on a tour, like a holiday tour. I know it sounds a bit bizarre place to go for a holiday, but I went there on a holiday. And back in 2002. And for the mass games there, the Arirang 100,000 people mass gymnastics, it's like the biggest example of socialist kitsch still going. And they let Americans in often for that game, but we were in one floor of the Yanggak-do Hotel. The Americans were on the other floor. But actually both parties were all expatriates living in Beijing at the time, and so we all knew each other. But they wouldn't ever let us meet anywhere. So we do all the regular things. You go to Kim Il-sung's birthplace, and the Americans were taken in and shown round. And once they'd finished, we were taken in and shown round. Then we go to the sort of children's palace to see something. The Americans would see it first, then we'd see it first. And we were just like, well, why can't... And then eventually they took us on this boat where you could have some sort of Korean hot pot. And it's a 2-story boat, like a sort of Mississippi River cruiser, but not that... Probably makes it sound a bit grand. The Americans had to sit downstairs, and we sat upstairs. When I say we, I mean various Eurotrash, Aussies, Kiwis, and all the rest of it. And at one point we said, well, why can't we meet them? And although there was a fire escape from our floor down to the Americans' floor, they had security guards on this. We said, well, we know these guys, why can't we go and see them? And they said, well, they're imperialists. And we said, but most of us are British. We kind of invented imperialism here. And they said, no. I said, no, you're not as bad imperialists as they are. We don't want you to get affected by that. And we just weren't, that's it. So every time our coach would pull up, there'd be the Americans leaving, and we'd all be waving at each other, which was sort of quite bizarre. But so there's still this. But no, there's hotels, there's restaurants, and of course you have a fairly privileged position there. The difficult thing, of course, is moving around the country. I'm not sure how the tour groups work now. My advice to people would be, you used to be able to do tour groups where you could fly in and then train out. There's a train from Shenyang or Beijing down to, there's certainly one from Beijing still down to Pyongyang. That's fairly, that way you get to see some of the countryside, some of the state of agriculture. And I think that, of course, the first thing that hits you there is, one, how unproductive the fields look and how few domestic animals there are. It's never a good sign when the domestic animals are not there, because it means people have eaten them rather than used them as tools. And when there's large amounts of arable space without seed, it means that they've been eating the seed rather than planting it, which is worrying. And you'll go through some secondary towns, which is interesting. And then I would argue, then you can fly out with the wonderful Air Koyo, a member of Nobody's Frequent Flyer Club, as far as I can make it.
I'm Neil from Oxford. I was wondering if you think China has any territorial ambitions on North Korea, because Koreans seem to worry about that a lot. And what do you think of the Koguryo historical controversy?
Do you know, I don't know anything about that. There's no point in pretending I do. I did these meetings with 10 or 12 Chinese academics at think tanks. And basically, I had like four or five set questions, which were really about the North Korean economy and North Korean-Chinese relationships. It never came up with any of them. I know it got picked up by the newspapers in China, but to be honest, it's not something I've followed, and I don't really know that much about it. So anything else I say on that, I'll be bullshitting, really. So I'm not going to.
I've been quite alarmed by the nuclear testing by North Korea, and certainly what you're saying in terms of conventional warfare, that would hold true. But they are in the process of developing their nuclear capability, and so that's a whole different ball game. And I was wondering whether you could comment on the South Korean so-called sunshine policy and what effect it might have had over the past 8 years. Two South Korean administrations giving aid to North Korea, which a lot of people, international observers, have claimed have been used to develop their nuclear weapons rather than feed the starving population. And if, as you said earlier, that South Korean policy, which I regard as appeasement, which a lot of people would disagree, have objections to, if that's not now leading to reunification, then where is it headed? Because, as far as reunification, we can have arguments both sides, and even a lot of Koreans of younger generations, unless it has benefits, they're not quite keen, because, the downside is potentially so great. So where is the South Korean policy headed? And in this regard, I might also, having just worked 3 years in South Korea as a lawyer,
we don't have a lot of time left.
Yeah, sorry. I'd just like to say there's a lot of cynical view, which I came across, where they're saying South Korea does not believe that North Korea will use the nuclear weapon on South. If anything, they'd use it on Japan or someone else. But, in the event of reunification, there'd be a nuclear power, something they cannot do directly.
Yeah, well, as I said earlier, I don't think they've developed a bomb in order to bomb anyone. I think they've developed a bomb in order to sell it to the West, or sell it to any consortium of countries that wish to put the money together, which is what we did in '94. America negotiated the deal and then got South Korea and Japan to pay for it, right, through the KEDO organization. So I certainly don't think that they're going to drop a bomb on anyone, but I also don't think that. I think Sunshine Policy didn't necessarily allow them to develop a bomb. I think that Sunshine Policy on the economic side, did mostly things that as I said in answer to this lady's question over here, which allowed the economy to stop its complete slide into a second famine, what's known as the second apocalypse. And so therefore we've seen large supplies of fertilizer go across the border, and large supplies of medicine go across the border. And none of this actually goes across for free, because of course, the North Koreans are sending down sand and gravel and shale and everything, which the South Korean building industry, construction industry needs a lot of, and they're paying a sort of fraction for it. But in order for anything to happen, this is where it all gets a bit train spottery, but for anything to happen in North Korea's agricultural sector, there needs to be a solution found to fertilizer and to pesticides because of that historic dependence on it. The problem was that because the Soviet Union developed their fertilizer and pesticide policy, this is where I always get blogs, guys that do blogs always accuse me of going on about fertilizer too much. But it's true, because the Soviet Union gave them their fertilizer, and they're all petroleum-based fertilizer. So they don't have enough petrol, but they used to not have to care because it all just came from the Soviet Union at fraternal rates. Now they have an additional problem, and South Korea has been able to help with that. And the one big, real, what could be life-changing, regime-changing fallout from the Sunshine Policy is Kaesong. Kaesong is incredibly important because Kaesong, within the reformist caucus in North Korea, Kaesong is a symbol. It's a symbol of the fact that it proves that North Korean workers can make things that can be sold, and that all of this can be done without necessarily contaminating the entire country and North Korea falling apart completely. And this is what has not been able to convince the leadership for so long. It goes right the way back to when Kim Il-sung met Deng Xiaoping. And Deng Xiaoping said to him, Kim, why don't you, like we have, open a window? And Kim Il-sung came straight back and said, the problem with opening windows is you let flies in. And this whole thing about spiritual pollution and pollution of the system is still blocked there. And what the reform element in North Korea was hoping for was that Kaesong would be a success, which it by and large is, and then they would be able to extend that or to open it in new ways or to look at new policies, which is what they tried to do in 2002 but backed away from, which is more something between Kaesong and the Chinese joint venture special economic zone that we saw in southern China in the 1980s. Something between that, if you like. That kind of Chinese reform but with North Korean characteristics. And that kind of the success of Kaesong, and as I said before, when the Americans ruled Kaesong-made products out of the free trade agreement, which actually the Chinese haven't. They've included it in their free trade agreement with the South Koreans. That really shut the door on that. And there had been a lot of talk about restarting the Sinway-Ju zone, revamping Rajin up on the northeast coast and so on, and expanding Kaesong. And all of that has fallen through now. But I think, there's no reason why Kaesong can't continue to grow and transform from what it is into something more and something that can change economic policy. So to me, the real lasting thing of Sunshine will be Kaesong, I think.
It's a relatively optimistic note on which to close. One of the few of the evening, I think. And it only remains to me to thank Paul for displaying such extraordinary knowledge and understanding of one of the world's most opaque countries, and for imparting it so lucidly and entertainingly. Thank you very much, Paul.